I'd like to welcome our third panel, Chairwoman Dr. Virginia Fox and Ranking Member Bobby Scott from the Committee on Education and the Workforce. Dr. Fox is still en route, so Ranking Member Scott, pending her arrival, we'll hear from you first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, good afternoon, Ranking Member McGovern and members of the Rules Committee. I'm here to speak in opposition to H.J. Res. 165, the Congressional Review Act resolution to repeal the Biden-Harris administration's Title IX rule. The administration's final Title IX rule does...
Continue.
I'll suspend.
No, please continue.
Okay.
No, please go ahead.
Okay. The Title IX rule does three things. First, it protects against all sex-based harassment and discrimination. It reverses arbitrary provisions in the Trump-era Title IX rule that allows colleges and universities to turn a blind eye to sex-based harassment and discrimination based on where it was happening. If it didn't happen on campus, for example, they don't have to pay any attention to it. It prevents schools from ignoring harassment and discrimination by placing a duty to report possible discrimination on more school employees. Consistent with the Supreme Court precedent, it recognizes that discrimination based on sex includes discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, fully protecting LGBTQIA+ youth from discrimination in educational settings. Second, it promotes accountability and fairness in how schools respond to and discipline sex-based discrimination. This will mandate that schools deal with complaints in a timely manner and ensure a fair and transparent process, as opposed to the previous rule that allowed schools to deal with these cases at their own pace so long as they were not deliberately indifferent. New rule also outlines the specific standards, rules, and processes that schools must implement to bring their grievance procedures into compliance with the rule. Finally, the rule empowers students and families to exercise their rights under Title IX. Administration's Title IX rule explicitly protects complainants from retaliation for seeking to have their Title IX rules enforced. Further, the bill ensures survivors and the accused to have access to supportive services as needed. In sum, the administration's Title IX rule protects all people from sex-based discrimination, including women, girls, LGBTQ individuals, and survivors of sexual assault, while maintaining the rights of the accused and mandating equitable processes for resolving complaints. This rule will uplift and empower these individuals to speak up for themselves and make our communities safer. Unfortunately, this important discussion on non-discrimination has been marred by consistent misinformation and attempts by Republicans to weaponize women's rights and scapegoat the LGBTQIA+ community for imagined crimes. I would hope that every single person believes that the restrooms should be kept safe and private. It is illegal for anyone to enter a restroom to harm someone. Unfortunately, my colleagues have invented a narrative that portrays trans individuals as criminals attempting to enter restrooms to harm young girls, but that simply is not supported by evidence or data. Transgender people want the same things everyone else wants: safety, comfort, and privacy. We must work to protect the transgender community from discrimination, not further a false narrative that exacerbates and encourages prejudice against innocent people. Lastly, I want to point out that this CRA is extreme. It is in the unlikely event that the joint resolution passes both chambers and is signed by the President, it would prohibit any future regulations that are substantially similar to the current rule. This means future administrations would not be able to regulate this topic, including providing protections for sexual assault survivors and protections against discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity in federally funded schools. If we really care about protecting women, we would spend less time obsessing over which bathroom to use and more time defending women's rights to reproductive health care, supporting proposals to make child care more affordable, and finally, fighting to close the gender pay gap. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak in opposition to the joint resolution, welcome your questions, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks. The ranking member, the chairwoman of the committee is now recognized, Dr. Fox.
Well, okay, well, I'll try that one. This one doesn't seem to be working. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing us to come to the Rules Committee today to present HJ Res 165, CRA resolution to nullify President Biden's Title IX rule. We recently celebrated the 52nd anniversary of Title IX, which protects women and girls from discrimination in schools, colleges, and universities. 52 years ago, President Nixon and a Democrat-controlled Congress knew the biological differences between a man and a woman. 52 years ago, women were given equal opportunities in education under the law. The science and innate biological differences between a man and a woman have not changed. Shockingly, the partisan politics have. The Biden administration has decided to appease a radical left-wing agenda rather than uphold the equality and safety of women and girls. The Biden administration's final Title IX rule allows men to intrude into women's spaces and strips away athletic and scholarship opportunities, jeopardizing the equality originally provided for women's sports and activities and paralyzing the safety of single-sex private spaces for girls. HJ Res 165 is a Congressional Review Act, CRA, resolution to nullify the Biden administration's Title IX rule. The Education and Workforce Committee has talked a lot about 52 years of progress for women's sports and schooling, but I want to leave you with one more comment. Less than 1/100th of a second, that is, by how much former NCAA swimmer Riley Gaines lost to a biological man during a swim match. Miss Gaines will never get that 1/100th of a second back, but nullifying the administration's Title IX rule will return 52 years of opportunities and fairness to women and girls in schools across the country. I urge the passage of the CRA resolution to correct the Biden administration's injustice toward women and girls and to protect the integrity and safety of the schooling and sports of the next generation of America's women leaders. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks both of our panelists for their testimony. Let me just ask you, Dr. Fox, this rule came from the Department of Education, and how would the schools actually implement what they're asking? What type of burden are we placing on the schools themselves?
Well, what it's going to do is going to say to the schools that they have to treat biological males who say they feel like females as though they are females. It's an overstep by the federal government. We know that already that 3 different federal courts have ruled against the administration's regulation. I think that says more than anything else. One judge called the regulation, quote, an abuse of power, and argued that the regulation subverts the purpose of Title IX. I agree with that. Nobody in his or her right mind thinks Congress intended Title IX to protect the rights of boys to shower with girls, but that's exactly what this rule does. It also undermines protections, not only undermines them, but decimates them. The rule eliminates the right of schools to prevent males from intruding in women's private spaces. It eliminates the right of schools to ensure that women can use the bathroom, change clothes, or even shower without men present. The rule also eliminates female-only sports. That was mostly what Title IX was all about when it was passed, to give women and girls equal opportunity in sports. And what this is doing, basically, is wiping out opportunity for women. It's really a puzzle to me, because Democrats, as I said, this was signed when Democrats were in control of Congress. President Nixon was president. It was a bipartisan issue in those days. Now, it appears as though Democrats want to erase women by allowing men to compete. And we've all seen episodes other than Riley Gaines' episode where men have competed against women. And we know men and women are different. And men have biological advantages over women when it comes to sports, when it comes to lots of other things. And it really is going to harm women.
Well, thank you for your work on this. I agree with you completely that it does subvert the purpose of the original intent of Title IX, and I hope that you're successful with getting this passed. I'll recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for questions.
Thank you. I mean, the history of this Department of Education Title IX rule, I'm sorry. Can we move to Ms. Ledger-Fernandez and then
Yeah, without objection.
Yes, thank
Gentlelady's
you.
recognized.
Thank you so very much, my wonderful colleague from Pennsylvania. You know, the thing about this rule is that we know that sex discrimination disproportionately impacts women and LGBTQ plus student athletes. That's just a fact. They get harassed more, they get assaulted more. That's why I applauded the Biden administration's update to the Title IX regulations. Let's all remember, the Trump administration passed regulations making it easier for those who discriminate against and harass student athletes, especially women athletes, especially LGBTQ athletes, to get away with it. They made it easier for those predators to harass and attack our student athletes. This is not surprising, given the fact that a key figure in the Trump administration has to pay $88.3 million in verdicts arising from a sexual assault and subsequent defamation. If the leader of the former administration was found guilty of sexual assault, how could we expect that administration to protect student athletes from sexual assault? So I'm very grateful that the Biden administration adopted a new regulation that honors Title IX, which restores and expands protections for women and LGBTQ student athletes. This regulation recognizes that they are the most at risk for harassment and bullying. Sadly, this legislation to overturn the Biden rule is just another piece of Republicans' attack on women and LGBTQ trans and the most vulnerable student athletes. And with that, I will yield back and thank you very much for coming. But Mr. Scott, is there anything else you would like to add to this?
Yeah, the this rule did not include provisions on athletics. That's still being considered in the department, and that rule will be coming out later. But when you talk about athletics, that is a very complicated situation, but it's not dealt with in this rule.
Yeah, if you want to say something, Ms. Fox?
Well, I do. Respectfully, what my colleague just said is absolutely not true. It does impact on sports. Now, the Biden administration has soft-pedaled what it's doing in sports. They don't want to put anything out big before the election because they know what a brouhaha it's going to be. But the regulation says schools are not allowed to prevent a person from participating in an education program or activity consistent with the person's gender identity. There are exceptions to that general policy, but athletics is not included in the exceptions. So athletics are included in this policy that the Biden administration. They are going to put out a separate rule, as I said earlier, on athletics. But it's, I think, using that proposed rule to mislead the American people in Congress into thinking that athletics aren't affected by the rule this resolution would stop. So we can see through the Biden administration's attempt to mislead, and we have an opportunity to pass this resolution and protect women's sports.
I think both appreciate you bringing this up. Doesn't this get back to the core belief that men and women are biologically different? Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree with that, Bobby?
Sure.
Do you, either one of you think that men ought to be able to play in women's sports?
I do not. I believe men should not participate in women's sports.
The Olympics, the NCAA, and other athletic leagues have been dealing with that for decades, and I think we can defer to their judgment.
No, but what's your core belief?
Well, if it's women's sports, it ought to be women, but then how you define women, as I said, the Olympics have been dealing with that for decades.
No, but your core belief as an elected representative are biological, let me ask you this.
I would defer to the Olympics and the NCAA and other sports leagues to make that determination. Who plays on what sports?
Yeah, but Bobby, we make the laws up here.
Say again?
We're making the laws up here.
Okay.
I mean, you have to have a core belief in it. Now, if you think men ought to biological, not identification, do you believe in identification? If you identify as a female, you ought to be able to play in a female sport.
Like I said, the Olympics and NCAA
Okay, well,
and others have been dealing with this, and you're asking a question to go through all of their considerations and how you define who can play on which sport.
but Scott, I mean, if you don't want to answer that, but I had
But I don't want to answer yes or no. You've had agencies who've been dealing with this for decades.
But you're against this resolution, aren't you?
I am.
Okay. So that pretty well says that you think there's no difference in a biological man and a biological woman. And to say anything to not support this, I mean, I guess that's your belief. My question a year ago, where one of your, hold on, I'm reclaiming my time, and I'll give you a chance to respond, but my question with one of your colleagues who says, yeah, I think if you identify as a female, that regardless of biological, what you are, then you ought to be able to play. And my next question for him was, would you let your daughter get in the ring with Mike Tyson?
Well, like I said, the Olympics and all the other sports have been dealing with that, and what the discrimination has been defined, or based on account of sex, has been defined by the Supreme Court. Now, I'm aware that a lot of people don't agree with what the Supreme Court did.
Well, we make the
but that's
laws up here, Mr. Scott, you know
That's the
that.
Supreme Court.
And just like, can a biological man have a baby? I don't think so. That's not even, I mean, that's not, you know the truth on that. Miss Virginia, you are totally against a biological man, biological, not identifying as a man, should not be able to play. And as far as protecting women, to say that if you believe anything else, the examples that we had in 2022, North Carolina volleyball player Peyton McNabb suffered a serious injury after a trans-identified male player spiked a ball and rendered her unconscious. How's that fair to women? Last year, a female athlete was injured by a trans-identified male during a hockey game in Massachusetts when a ball he threw at her knocked her front teeth out. Is that protecting women? No, and we just had Riley games in South Carolina, and Ms. Fox, she actually tied she made those seconds up, and the whole, if she'd been a second under, a microsecond under, she wouldn't have been a question. The great part about this, she tied a biological male who, as Riley said, was intact, and who I would also add was having relations with the opposite sex in the changing rooms. To show you how ridiculous this is. But she tied them, and then they wanted, because of the woke philosophy that this administration has taken, they wanted to give it to the trans female, which is ridiculous. I hope the Democrats keep doing this. The public is sick of this. This is just common sense. And to defer to any other agency, you have a core belief, we make the laws, we make the rules, and you'll be voting on this. And this isn't, with all the problems we've got to even have to do this with the Biden administration, with what their interpretations are. But thank you for doing it. Now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing us to switch order earlier. Look, all students deserve to learn in an environment free from discrimination, sex-based harassment, bullying, and it's critical that our schools have the tools and responsibility to provide that environment. The Department of Education's Title IX rule is critical to ensuring that the department enforces the rights of women, survivors of sexual violence, and LGBTQI+ students. So the rule pushes colleges and universities to better address cases of discrimination and harassment, and it clarifies that Title IX protects LGBTQI+ students with its promise of gender equality. The rule is realistic in that it contains important exceptions and other flexibility that gives schools the leeway necessary to appropriately comply with Title IX, and none of this should be controversial or complicated. Ranking Member Scott, I've just got a couple questions here. We're talking about a CRA, right? So the entire rule would be gutted and the administration could not revisit it for a period of time. Is that right?
Couldn't revisit, the present administration, future administrations couldn't visit it, and you'd be stuck with the 2020 rule
Okay.
because you would have eliminated the recent rule and you're stuck with the 2020 rule.
Okay, so does the Biden administration's Title IX rule strengthen protections for student survivors, making it easier for survivors to report sexual misconduct and prevent schools from ignoring reports of sexual misconduct?
They make several improvements, one of which in the 2020 rule that would go into effect if this were to pass and eliminate the recent rule, says if it happens off campus, the college can ignore it, although even though technically off campus, a lot of students are participating in student activities. Off campus, you can just ignore those altogether. The number of employees who have to make reports is limited in the old report. That would be reinstated. The present rule requires you to have timely hearings. You can't just string the thing out. I mean, there are a lot of improvements, and it has an anti-retaliation provision.
Okay, so it clarifies that higher ed institutions can't ignore off-campus problems, and it says that they can't just turf these complaints. Does the rule also ensure that sex discrimination and sexual harassment claims don't have to have higher standards of proof compared to other harassment claims?
The old rule allowed you to have different standards. This says you should have the same standard as others. So if you're proving sexual harassment, you should have the same based on other factors, race, religion, and whatnot. You shouldn't have a higher standard for sex.
Okay, and does this rule ensure that pregnant and parenting students have equal educational opportunities and are not discriminated against?
And failure to give them equal opportunity would constitute discrimination.
Okay, so I just wanted to be clear that House Republicans are willing to get rid of this rule, leaving student survivors of sexual assault less protected, leaving pregnant students less protected, and just to target transgender students, presumably. So it really appears to be about bigotry, plain and simple. Trans students exist. They are subject to discrimination. We need to protect them as well. They're not going to be removed from public life, and you shouldn't be supporting things to remove them from our schools. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter signed by dozens of organizations, including women, medical professionals, LGBTQ rights organizations, labor organizations, sports organizations, and others, all opposing HJ Res 165.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
And the gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to Dr. Fox, Chairwoman Fox, and the ranking member for coming before the Rules Committee. As a member of the Education and Workforce Committee, I'm certainly happy to have considered this and many other issues this Congress. As you know, the committee did pass the Protection of Women and Girls Sports Act in an effort to protect Title IX, which the Department of Education has failed to do. As a parent of 2 female student athletes, I do have a vested interest in this issue. I had the opportunity to speak with Riley Gaines on her personal experience competing against a biological male, as well as the NCAA allowing Leah Thomas full access to female locker rooms without the female swimmer's consent. And when Secretary Cardona came before our committee to testify, you might remember that I asked him a question requiring women to undress in front of Leah Thomas and allowing Leah to undress in front of them. I asked the secretary if he believed that constituted sexual harassment, and his answer was yes. I was surprised that he answered it that way, but as the questioning went on, he realized where I was going with that. I said if Leah Thomas identified it as a male, would requiring female swimmers to dress with him have constituted sexual harassment? And he said, yes. So I find it odd that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so intent on opposing what we're simply asking, which is to protect the integrity of women's sports for biological women and to protect women from having men in their locker rooms. And as parents of 2 daughters who were swimmers, this is an issue that is something that mothers and parents across the country, unfortunately, are having to deal with, and the Biden administration has just simply doubled down on it. So to Chairwoman Fox, I want to touch a little bit about, there was a recent Supreme Court decision in the Loper-Bright case overturning Chevron deference. Do you think that this rule should be overturned by the courts?
Oh, absolutely, and we already have split decisions on the part of the courts on this issue, and we've got 2 different court cases, and I want to make sure I stay on the right one, but yes, I think that it could be overturned by the courts, and again, we've got court precedent where 2 courts, or one court said, here we go, a split among federal courts. In January of last year, the 11th Circuit held that a school district's policy requiring people to use the bathroom that corresponds with the student's biological sex is allowed under Title IX. In addition, the first 2 court cases that have been handed down in cases challenging this regulation have argued that the regulation's an overreach and an abuse of power. So the argument that with this rule, the Biden administration is simply doing what courts have said must be done when they're talking about Bostock in that case, the opposite is true. The Supreme Court explicitly warned against applying its Bostock ruling to Title IX, but the Biden administration is ignoring that warning.
Chairwoman Fox, do you think Congress intended Title IX to protect the rights of boys to shower with girls?
Absolutely not.
And this action by the Biden administration, does it not invent such a right for more than 50 years after Title IX's enactment? It seems like this is that type of overreach, that it codifies, if you will, that the Biden administration believes that boys do have a right to shower with girls.
I think that's absolutely true. Again, as I said in my earlier comment, Title IX was designed to protect women, give them equal opportunity, and this is wiping it out. And it's really a puzzle to me as to why the Democrat Party has decided to wipe out women.
Mr. Scott, you have made, you received some questions from my colleague, Mr. Norman, and he asked if you believe there are differences between men and women, and you said yes. You do believe there are differences between men and women.
Yes.
Yes. So I just want to ask you, and this is in all seriousness, how do you define a woman? What is a woman?
Well, if you, how do I define a woman?
How would you define a woman?
If you're looking for, you mentioned some court cases, the Bostock.
Well, I didn't ask about,
two-
I didn't
two-
ask about the court cases. Before you get to the court cases, what is a woman?
You have men, you have women. I mean, if you don't know, I can't help you.
Well, I know. It's a biological human female. I was asking if you know.
Well, what's a female?
Well, a female
Okay, well,
is,
in the months following the Bostock decision, 2 appellate courts have reached the same conclusion, citing that case in their holdings that Title IX protects transgender students from discrimination on the basis of gender identity. I think that's the important, if you're talking about court cases, I think that's the important aspect.
is a man that identifies as a female a woman?
I'd say there's transgender.
If a man identifies as a female, is that a woman?
I think it's a transgender woman.
Is it a woman? Is it a biological human female?
I don't know what difference that makes.
Chairwoman Fox, would you care to answer?
I believe that a woman has distinct chromosomes, a man has distinct chromosomes, and that's how you distinguish between a man and a woman. And I think we know what women are and what men are based on their chromosomes.
It's kind of hard to believe that we have to have this conversation in the halls of Congress about what is a woman, and there are differences between men and women, and we do know there are differences between men and women, and we know it is particularly evident in the playing of sports. And Mr. Norman and others have referenced some of the injuries that have happened to female athletes in competing against biological males. So Chairwoman Fox, I just want to thank you for your leadership on this issue and your strong stance to protect women and girls' sports and women and girls in their private spaces. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. The ranking member is recognized.
Yeah,
for
I'll ask some
questions.
questions. I can't believe we're even talking about this stuff, but anyway, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fox, it's always nice to see you. To recap, the resolution before us today is not discriminating against or barring any individual from athletic or other opportunities. Is that correct?
Correct.
Correct. Thank you. This is about protecting access to everything from athletics to intimate spaces to scholarships for biological females. In other words, access to opportunities based on one's biological sex and scientifically proven physiological differences. Would that generally be correct, Dr. Fox?
Yes, sir, and I appreciate your talking about science.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. As the father of a daughter who participates in youth sports, I am glad to see this resolution before us today. What the Biden administration is doing to undermine access to opportunities for biological women to participate and compete in sports is not only alarming, but it flies entirely in the face of scientific reality. Once again, we're seeing an administration pander to a radical base, and this will be at the cost of access for women and girls to athletic and other opportunities in the future that until recently have been solidly protected under Title IX. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with the ranking member. I can't believe we're actually having to discuss this. Wimbledon's going on right now. They have men's tennis, they have women's tennis, and they have mixed doubles. But I think, just as a father with a 10-year-old little girl and a 6-year-old little boy, they understand the difference. It's kind of embarrassing that the President of the United States doesn't.
This is gentleman yield back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. want to thank this panel for a thought-provoking discussion, and this panel is excused.
Thank you, Mr.
I know we're up against a vote, but I would like to welcome our fourth panel, Representative Jeff Duncan, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member Frank Pallone from the Committee on Energy and Commerce.
Mr. Chairman, I have letters to introduce by unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Okay. Thank you.
Being mindful of the new rules on votes and how quickly